me ask you about Sweden and Finland. Would you have foreseen that they would ask to become members of NATO after this crisis? And do you think it's a good or bad idea for them to do it?
I didn't foresee it simply because there's no threat to them. I mean, the conventional wisdom in the West is that the Russians were bent on conquering Ukraine, occupying Ukraine, and incorporating it into a greater Russia. And then when the Russians were done with Ukraine, they were to conquer countries in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and so forth and so on. Putin is basically an imperialist in this story. There is no evidence, zero evidence, that Putin was interested in conquering Ukraine and absorbing it into a greater Russia. There is no evidence that he was interested in conquering any other country in Eastern Europe. Furthermore, if you look at Russian capabilities, what they've done in Ukraine, there is no reason to think that they had the capability or the intention of conquering Finland or Sweden or the Baltic states. This is a figment of the West's imagination.
So do you think it makes it more or less safe for Sweden and Finland to be within NATO?
I think it makes it more dangerous. And the reason is that you're encircling the Russians. The Russians, there are three great powers in the world: the United States, China, and Russia. China is a peer competitor of the United States. China is the real threat to the United States. That's why we talked about a pivot to Asia. Russia is the weakest of those three great powers by far. Russia is not a threat to conquer Eastern Europe, to dominate all of Europe, the way the Soviet Union was after 1945. Russia does not equal the Soviet threat, period.
Point.
Therefore, you want to be very careful that you don't put the Russians in a situation where they think their survival is threatened. They think that they're being encircled. They understand that they are the weakest of the three great powers, and they understand that NATO has its gun sights on them. So when you bring Finland and Sweden into the alliance, you bring Ukraine into the alliance, right? You're giving the Russians a sense that their survival is at risk, that they're facing an existential threat. And that's going to put them in the situation where they may feel desperate and they may lash out in ways that lead to serious trouble. So if anything, what we should be doing is backing off and working out some sort of modus vivendi. But instead, we're doing exactly the opposite. There's no reason for Finland and Sweden to join NATO.
Well, except that they want to. I mean, the people in Sweden are frightened of Russia. They are very conscious of their proximity to Russia. There's always fears of sightings of U-boats in Stockholm Harbour and so on. It's a big part of sort of Swedish imagination and sense of their place in the world. And now they see what's happened in Ukraine. They are seeking greater defense, and that's their reality.
So,
Would you say we should say no to Sweden and Finland as NATO?
I would say no, but that's not going to happen. I mean, we have an open door policy. That's what's gotten us into trouble over Ukraine. We believe in the West that any country in Europe has the right, and that's a very important word, has the right to join NATO. And we have been bringing in more and more countries since 1999. The first big tranche, of course, was in 99. The second big tranche was in 2004. The Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and a handful of other countries.
Slovakia.
And then in 2008, that's when we began to talk about the third big tranche. That's when Georgia and Ukraine were going to come in. And we haven't given up on that. And at the same time, now we're talking about bringing Finland and Sweden in. You know, the Americans have the Monroe Doctrine. I don't know what you know about the Monroe Doctrine, but the Monroe Doctrine basically says the Western Hemisphere is our backyard. And no distant great power, which means no great power from Europe or from Asia, is allowed to put military forces in the Western Hemisphere. No great power from Europe or
Asia is allowed to form a military alliance with another country in the Western Hemisphere. Because from the American perspective, it's intolerable to have a distant great power on our doorstep. Well, the same basic logic applies to the Russians and to the Chinese, by the way.
Oops.
From a Russian perspective, the idea that you're going to have NATO right on your doorstep, and NATO is bringing in more and more countries that are part of this alliance, is going to be unacceptable to them. The Russians couldn't stop NATO from expanding in 1999. They couldn't stop it in 2004 because they were too weak. And you know what happens as a good realist when you're weak in international politics. Other great powers take advantage of you. This is what happened to China in the late 1840s to the late 1940s. The Chinese refer to this as their century of national humiliation. When you're weak, other great powers take advantage of you. This is exactly what the Americans did with the Russians. Russia was weak after the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991, and we took advantage of the Russians. We shoved NATO expansion down their throat in 99, we shoved it down their throat in 2004, and we decided we were going to shove it down their throat again after 2008, because we thought they were too weak to prevent it, right? But the fact is, the Russians viewed this eventually as an existential threat. The idea of Ukraine in NATO was the brightest of all red lines for the Russians. And you see what is happening now. And if you think about the Monroe Doctrine, you should not be surprised how the Russians are reacting to what's going on in Ukraine.